excited today to introduce to you Katie Hirschboek, who by chance was, not by chance, by love, was born in Milwaukee. And she spent her formative years in Wisconsin, where she says her love and awe of the natural world developed in tandem with an ever deepening faith that was nurtured by her parents, 12 years of Catholic school by the progressive Dominican sisters, the spiritual direction of Vatican II priests during her college years and beyond. In the 1980s, she embarked on her career as an earth scientist. What were you doing in the 70s and 80s? So she was already ahead of the game, embarking as an earth scientist. She earned her BS and MS degrees in geography at the University of Wisconsin and her PhD in geosciences at the University of Arizona, followed by her first faculty appointment at Louisiana State University in 1984. In 1991, she was invited to return back to Arizona, to Tucson, to join the University of Arizona faculty as a climate scientist, laboratory of tree ring research, with a joint appointment in hydrology and atmospheric sciences, geography and development, arid lands resources sciences, and the global change graduate interdisciplinary program. Whoa. Sometimes we just go into one department. She's dealing with so much. 30 years in academia, Katie has taught thousands, I suspect tens of thousands of undergraduates about global climate change, while also mentoring graduate students and pursuing her own research on climate variability. Floods, droughts, tree rings, and volcanic eruptions. She's now retired and holds the title of the Joint Associate Professor Emeritus of Climatology at the Laboratory of Ring Research and the Department of Hydrology and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Arizona. Katie is now a retiree. She has more time and probably more to do with work in the community, her parish to further her commitment to Catholic social teaching and its consistent ethic of life. As a Catholic climate ambassador for the U.S. Catholic Climate Covenant and a Laudate Si animator for the global Laudate Si movement, she's able to share both a scientific and a faith-based understanding of climate change and the urgent need to care for our common home with fellow Catholics and faith communities. And I also want to mention, as all of us sitting here have had great desires to know and love God more, she spent a period of time at the Cistercian or Trappistine Monastery in the California Redwoods, discerning a vocation to the contemplative monastic life before she returned to academic life. So I think, she walks on 2 feet, as we all do, but very deeply, both in faith and as a scientist. So please welcome Katie. I think we're really, really blessed to have you with us. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm just amazingly wonderful group to be with. And I'm excited about sharing with you. There were a million things I could share. I put together a set of them and we'll begin. So I need to share my screen. Is that correct?
Yes,
can you see that?
Not yet, Katie.
Not yet.
Always technical problems, right? Let me try that again. Share screen. Now I think you will be able to see it. How about that?
Yes, it's coming up.
Okay.
Here it is.
Very good.
Okay, so I'm in the tree ring lab as a professor, still now emeritus, but I've always loved trees for various reasons. And I noticed as I was reading the encyclical for the first time, how often the Pope used the word roots. And it just became a natural way for me to put together various things. And so we're going to talk about the Pope's radical call, care for our common home, and the science behind it. Some of you may know the science, some not, but Jean seemed to want me to talk a little bit about the basic science. So I dusted off my freshman notes and did that. But I do want to start with a wonderful quote that came from one of the textbooks I use with my freshmen. It's from a physicist, and I call it Our Daily Breath. So this is the prologue. And in this text, the author said, atoms are forever, and very few have changed over time. And an image of a carbon atom, which is appropriate for this talk. A particular carbon atom might be a part of a skin cell today, part of gas in the atmosphere, a century from now, and a part of a tree a century after that. I hadn't really thought about the atomic level of the whole aspect of nature in our world. And so that was a great quote to use with the students. And this in particular, your atoms, the ones you are carrying around right now, have been borrowed from the air, from the soil, from the forests, and from every creature and person who has ever lived on Earth until they are given back. And that's a phenomenal thing. He used this quote when he was trying to teach them scientific notation and how small things were, and that every breath we take, we're basically taking in at least one atom from every other person who's ever lived, or animal perhaps. I still find it a shocking statement. But if it is actually true, what does this mean? It means that everything is connected. Our processes and actions in one part of the Earth atmosphere environment can have a profound and lasting impact on other parts at even the atomic scale, molecular scale. And as we know, as we understand how climate and climate variability work on the global scale. So part one of this talk is about our interconnected planet, which is of course a theme right through the cyclical. And when I first started my graduate work, PhD work at the University of Arizona, I took tree ring courses, and our textbook, this was actually the inside of a St. Bernard quote, which I love. Trees and stones will teach you that which you can never learn from masters. So we're going to learn some things from trees. And I'm going to share with you the most wonderful trees we have on the planet. There's an individual that's over 5,000 years old, a single tree. They're the oldest living things on Earth of an entity. And they're beautiful, wild looking. Sometimes they look like they're just living in this very severe environment on the just a little strip of bark. So these ancient bristlecone pine trees grow, the ones that we've found that are the oldest, grow very, very slowly. And they're at very high elevations, and they're inaccessible, so they haven't been chopped down for firewood and that kind of thing. And they're in, the oldest ones are in California and Nevada, probably. And the oldest living things are that we know of is an individual tree that's more than 5,000 years old. And you can visit the bristlecone pine and their national monument there. And they don't tell you where that tree is because people would start ripping off bark and they'd probably kill it. These trees have a remarkable combination of longevity and sensitivity. I think that's a nice description of who us older women are trying to be. So there's an image there. And one of the early articles, the person who basically discovered how old these were and did a lot of field work way back in the early 20th century was Edmund Shulman. And he wrote this wonderful paper called Longevity Under Adversity in Conifers. And that's also a nice quote for us who are getting older. I like that one. I have a piece of wood here that I'm showing you on the screen, but this is the original. Very precious to me, and it was given to me when I retired. And it's from a bristlecone pine. The inner date that we know of was before Christ, 2019. And the outer date when the tree was actually probably may have died, or they cut it down. They wouldn't have cut it down if they knew it was that old. 1957. So overall, it's what it lived at least for 4,076-year-old years. And if you think of all the carbon caught up in that tree, it's quite something. But what I love, the best part about this is you can barely see the rings here, but every ring has been dated, and that is actually the point of the BC AD transition. And so I think about this, the carbon caught up in this tree was being shared with everyone on Earth at that time, that maybe the baby Jesus's first cry of carbon atom is somehow embedded in this piece of wood. It's a wonderful thing to reflect on. And the overall message is that we are all connected with every breath of air we breathe. And that's something to meditate on. I do a lot, especially when I'm out of breath and I start thinking about what each breath means. I'm going to talk a little bit about tree rings. I hope you can see the full graph here and what they can tell us. And there are different ways we can get information from the trees. We can just measure the width of the tree ring. And this is a graph of varying tree widths over time, going way back to an individual that was at least 3,000 years old. And it's a group of several trees together, kind of an average. And you can see something going on right at the very end here. Something very unusual is going on, according to the author of the paper that put this figure together. And what we're finding, recent unprecedented tree ring growth in bristlecone pines in the highest elevations in the West. And so this is just one of a million different things we've seen lately in the 20th century and beyond of nature behaving in a way we're not familiar with. And unless you do paleoclimate work or paleo work of any kind, like going back to these old trees, you don't really understand how different the current time is. And so that's really the gift of looking back in time. So we know that we're in this human-induced global warming and climate change period. I look back at my career and I was a skeptic of human input in this, because if you study the paleo record, you're seeing so much change. And I thought, well, this is just an interesting period, like some of the ones we've had in the past. And it was really hard to see how the human beings could have that much impact on some of the changes we were seeing. This would have been in the 80s and when this was being talked about at first. And so this graph here shows a graph of how global temperatures have changed. This is average global temperatures, kind of showed as an anomaly from an average over a long period of time. So going back to 1880, much cooler than the present. Then there was a period back and forth. This is when I started my graduate career here in the 70s, and then retirement up here, 2017. And I gave a talk right on the day I retired, and I put a graph like this up saying, well, gosh, I caused global warming by being here at this time. But I want to point out a few things here. So what was interesting is right here in 79, in the middle of my first dissertation topic, was when I received this call to the Redwood Monastery, actually to be a Trappistine. That was the word that formed in my head. Why don't you be a Trappistine? And so I systematically went about writing places, looking at places, and ended up in a special 8-week program with the Redwoods Monastery of Trappistines. Beautiful place. I was 28. I was in the middle of my graduate work, but I took a semester off and thought this was it. Surrounded by trees. Halfway through, I was ready to sign up, but by the end, it just didn't seem right anymore. And the only thing that came clear to me was you have to go back and finish your dissertation, which was the last thing I wanted to find out. But it changed me forever, this particular thing that I went through, because just by going there, I moved out of my apartment. I gave away a lot of things. I was preparing myself to stay if that was what it would be. And then being with the nuns there, I don't know if any of you have visited, I got such an appreciation for how to be in awe and respect physical things. I loved just the way they lit a candle with a prayer. And so it slowed me down. It made me think about everything in a different way. And then I came back to academia, which of course was difficult, and I had picked a new dissertation topic, and et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, after several more years, graduated. So my years in academia, in 1984, as Jean mentioned, is when I started my first faculty position. And that also was a very important year with respect to this graph, because it was the year that James Hansen, a climate scientist, and his colleagues published a paper called Climate Sensitivity Analysis of Feedback Mechanisms, which sounds blah, blah. But it's really the first time I heard people talking out loud about how important the human impact was. And I was a skeptic of, as I said, if you studied things in the landscape and trees and whatever, going back thousands of years, I didn't see how humans could make that much difference. And so this paper said that we infer that because of recent increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide and trace gases, there is a large, rapidly growing gap between current climate and the equilibrium climate for current atmospheric composition. So he realized that, this paper realized that with the loads of CO2 and other gases in the atmosphere, which absorb energy from the earth and keep it in the atmosphere, that this is going to change things down the line. He said, based on the climate sensitivity we have estimated, the amount of greenhouse gases, as they're called, present in the atmosphere will cause an eventual global warming, mean warming of about 1 degree centigrade. I thought, but making the global temperature just 1 degree centigrade comparable to that of the warmest period of the past 100,000 years. Oh my goodness. So this was an important paper, and it got a lot of publicity eventually. You probably started hearing about it in the 90s. He would be talked about a lot. But I was a skeptic. But the temperatures kept increasing, and I was teaching global change in my classes in climate change. And another important moment happened back when I was at the Tree Ring Lab as a faculty member in 1991 is when I went there. And one of my colleagues in the department, Malcolm Hughes, Professor Malcolm Hughes, was one of the co-authors on this paper that came out in 1998. Michael Mann was the lead author, and it became known as the hockey stick paper. And many of you may have heard of this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the hockey stick. The hockey stick first paper has been considered to be the most controversial chart in science, according to Atlantic, who had an interesting article about this. So, and it was for the climate deniers. They threw all their might at disproving the fact that climate was warming and it was related to people. And they tried to show that the graph had been faked. They basically stole emails from my colleague and these authors. It just went on. It was a terrible time. And it was the beginning of the really loud voices that continue to be loud in many other ways and are almost some of the same people denying science, COVID science or whatever. But it was such an important graph showing this and degreeing way, way above anything we'd experienced in a natural or non-human impacted climate. That the authors of it said, okay, well, we got to make it better. And what I love about it is that science just persisted. So this was called the temperature hockey stick because of the way it sticks up. I don't know if you can see it where you're, I can't see it. Maybe I can remove you on my screen. How do I do that? So I'm not seeing the whole gallery.
Sure, Katie, put it on speaker view.
Okay, I don't see that. Maybe that's better. Okay. Anyway, so you can see it there. So the authors did another study and another study. And so this one was in 2001, same thing. And you can really see the huge spike happening at about the time that Hansen had shown in his theoretical understanding of what was going on. By 2007, there was another version of this. And what was different about this was it always produced the same hockey stick shape, but now it was being reproduced by different research groups, different data sets, and different reconstruction models of its past temperatures. And so it couldn't be dissed, shall I say, by the climate deniers. And what I like so much about it was a very difficult time for the authors because they were constantly being attacked, but it's an example of how the science of global climate change progresses and gets more certain over time. So a little bit more science. Why has this been happening? We see that there's been, using other kinds of data, not tree rings, but ice cores, that there's been a huge increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the bubbles of carbon dioxide get caught up into the ice when it's forming since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So here's 1750 and zoom. This is a carbon dioxide in parts per million in the atmosphere as seen in the the ice core record. And especially from the last 10,000 years. And then if you take a little, blow this up, really shooting up again right about the 1980s, late 1970s. And we know that this is also happening because since 1958, we've had excellent records of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's the famous Keeling curve, which is so sensitive, it can even show carbon going into and out of the atmosphere on an annual basis, as especially as the large forests in the northern hemisphere photosynthesize, and then when they drop their leaves and respire, it's almost like breathing, but always with this upward direction. And when we start looking at other kinds of elements, methane, nitrous oxide, all of these are the so-called greenhouse gases. Once again, this huge leap in the 20th century. So what do we mean by a greenhouse gas? This is a little tutorial, and you probably know this, but I had it from when I taught, so I thought I'd show it to you. it's basically greenhouse effect that we refer to is a very, very helpful thing. We wouldn't be alive on this planet without it. So it's a nice balancing act between energy from the sun coming to the earth and then going out. And how it works is radiation comes in, it's absorbed by the earth's surface, and then the earth radiates long wave or infrared radiation, like would come from your fireplace or whatever, back into the atmosphere. And some of the radiation from the earth gets radiated all the way out into space and cools us slightly. But a large portion of it is trapped in the atmosphere by these greenhouse gases, which absorb it. And this warms up the atmosphere and the earth. And if we didn't have this greenhouse effect, our temperature would be below freezing. We wouldn't know the earth as we do. So it was the formation of the greenhouse effect, the natural effect, that initially started the whole growth of everything in our Earth atmosphere system. Now, the problem is the increasing number of greenhouse gases coming directly from fossil fuels, which had been in the ground for millions of years and being released rapidly through all of our technology, which of course really blossomed with the arrival of the car and everything else in the 20th century and late 19th century. So human-related sources of these gases especially have been probably the biggest impact on our climate change. And there are other things, but this is it. A simple view just basically shows that the enhanced greenhouse effect and the energy balance shows that energy balance is changing. And we can now, even that assumption was dissed by the climate deniers, and more and more evidence would come together the way science is supposed to work. And the most interesting one was our satellites up there in the upper levels of the atmosphere were able to record less heat escaping into space because it was staying within our atmospheric system. And that was another way that we started to piece things together that we didn't even know you could measure. So where is all this extra heat going? Well, those of you by the ocean, 93% of it goes into the ocean. And you know that water, once heats up, holds its heat for a long time, doesn't it? Then the next is the atmosphere on the continental ice caps, Arctic Sea, green, and then there are ice sheets. And all of those are showing warming, all of those, but the ocean especially, but very, very slowly. And we didn't even think about it most of the time. Normally we think about the land and atmospheric temperature, but if you compare that, going back to 1970, when we really started to, the late 70s, it kicked off, you can see how much the ocean has warmed. And compared to what we, in that earlier graph that I showed you, that looked like it was like really spiking up, well, the ocean has warmed way more, which is why all sorts of concern and evidence of the ocean warming now is happening. Wow. Okay, so these are just a few headlines from recent years. There's the global surface temperature record up almost to today. Last year was the 6th straight year the Earth set records for the hottest in history. 2016 was even hotter than, it's actually cooled down a teeny bit in 2017 and here compared to 2016, which was I think the hottest. But NASA is showing Earth is warming at a pace unprecedented. You've seen it all. I finally believed with the wonderful paper on the hockey stick because it was tree ring. It was evidence that I understood. So that's the basic understanding. And Pope Francis does a pretty good job of talking about this in Laudato Si, but it's just touching the surface of the things we need to be thinking about with this problem. And so we're now going to start getting into the roots. And Laudato Si really, as I said, does a good job of covering the science and then getting right into the implications. It is Francis's radical and urgent appeal for a new dialogue. He loves dialogue. Have you had synods yet in your parish? For about how we are shaping the future of the planet. That just basically says it right there. We are shaping it. So I was so excited. I was already a Catholic climate ambassador before the encyclical came out, and I knew it was coming out. My husband and I were about to go on a road trip up to Winslow, Arizona, the day it came out. And so I stayed up all night, and 1 o'clock it was released on the Vatican website, and I printed it out and I put it in a notebook and I read it on the way up to Winslow. And got my marker and my red pen, and my poor husband's driving away. I'm saying one after the other, wow, wow. And mostly, I can't believe he said that. So he starts out, I wish to address every person living on the planet. Yeah, but by chapter 3, whoa, powerful truth. Wow, what an indictment. One of the best observations so far was this thing I highlighted, but humanity has changed profoundly, and the accumulation of constant novelties exalts a superficiality which pulls us in one direction. It becomes difficult to pause and recover depth in life. I mean, that's just one sentence in this beautiful encyclical that pulls together so many things, and some very poetic, and a lot of quotes from all sorts of previous popes and faith leaders, and from different faiths. It's every time I read it, and I do try to keep reading it. And right now in our Care for Creation committee, we're trying to read a page a day and start a little journal, and just to go back to the beginning and say, oh my. So what was going through my head the entire time on that drive up with my first reading was, wow, this is a radical piece of work. This is radical. And later on, I kept using it. And I said, you know, Katie, you better look up the definition of radical before you use that. And so here it is. There are 5 parts of it. Of, or relating to, or proceeding from a root. And I like that, connected to trees. Or growing from a stem that does not rise above ground. Of, or relating to the origin, fundamental. Very different from the usual or traditional, extreme. And that's usually what one thinks about with the term. And then, or number 5, favoring extreme changes in existing views, habits, conditions, or institutions. And I realized that these definitions of this verb, this noun, adjective, I guess it is, describes how Laudato Si touches us and is such an important thing to immerse yourself into. And so here's this very first definition. One was about a root, and there was the quote, I will attempt to get to the roots of the present situation so as to consider not only its symptoms, but also its deepest causes. Right there. And so symptoms, and he goes through them in Laudato Si. Meanwhile, I was teaching in my classes using this wonderful figure, which basically shows indicators of a warming world. And we've been seeing all of these go on. Glaciers melting, temperatures increasing over the land, over the oceans, humidity increasing, which is what's giving us these really intense rainstorms in some parts of the world, and drought in other parts of the world, like Arizona, where the temperature it rains. Spring's coming earlier. I know you're seeing that in California. Tree lines shifting poleward and upward, a very subtle thing to be able to see, but we're already seeing it. Snow cover going down, our precious snow cover, which is the source, especially in regions like California, where you get your winter moisture from snow, and then it helps to feed the dry summer. Same in Arizona, although we do get our little monsoon rains, which actually were pretty big this past year, so it helped us a little with our drought. Sea level going up as ice sheets melt. Ocean heat content, we already talked about that going up, it's been measured. Sea ice going down because of the warmer oceans. Species migrating, have you been noticing all the various stories about strange sights of owls and that kind of thing, and places you hadn't expected? So we have an entire globe full of evidence in nature speaking to us.
Okay.
And so because of this, humans are responsible, not just for the change, but for the abrupt increase in these heat trapping causes or heat trapping gases. And so right there, we're still only in like his 23rd paragraph where he comes out and says the concentration of greenhouse gases is mainly responsible. And that's not something I ever thought I would hear from a pope. And so think about my profession and my faith just being melded together with this. And the consequences, we have been seeing them, but we had been seeing them basically starting in the 1970s and 1980s. There's wonderful, you go back to some of the early climate change films, and they had it all right, even though people were saying, well, this might happen. We saw it all. And science, I love this quote, is demonstrating that the planet is more vulnerable than had previously been thought. With our fires, with our corals being bleached, with our floods, our hurricanes, melting ice and floods, droughts, it's all there. And every bit of these changes can be directly related to changes in the atmospheric circulation, driven in part by the imbalance with the extra greenhouse effect. So the next part of the radical definition is, this is definition number 2, very different from the usual or traditional extreme, which is a perfect example for what we've been going through. But it's not just the planet, it's the impact on people. The global poor are disproportionately affected by climate change, and that is a message right there in Laudato Si, and had been brought up earlier as these things started to manifest themselves. Water supply depletion, failed crops and flooded crops. The first, the deniers were saying, well, how can it be too much rain and too little rain at the same time? Well, it's a complex system that does that. Vector-borne diseases, we don't know yet of how climate change may have affected COVID, but somebody probably is working on that research right now. Loss of homelands and rising seas for all these coastal groups, conflict over scarce resources. We know that there's embattled things going on in some of our most vulnerable populations related to resources. And migration. I think we're officially not supposed to refer to environmental refugees because they're a specific definition of a refugee having a certain, there are only certain things that they can claim that are causing them to be, to migrate. But the term is out there and it's real. We see it. I see it at the southern border of Arizona and in all through Europe and many other places. This is a figure that just came out recently, and I think it really shows what the problem is in terms of the poor. The top left, CO2 emissions per capita, and look who's making all the problem, causing the problem. And the lower right, those places that are vulnerable to climate change. And People basically understand this, but the graph really shows it. And it's interesting, you just had the Glasgow COP26, and then prior to that, the Paris, and I don't have time to talk about them in detail. But something that struck me that I had missed with the Paris climate change conference was a special group, the work stream, as they call them, that was focusing on loss and damage. And that would be everything that's happening here in the lower diagram. And I have a colleague who's a professor at the University of Washington who was on the loss and damage group. And she was a climate scientist herself, and she thought she knew what needed to be done, and realized what a lack of understanding she had for what people are going through in loss and damage. And one of the most powerful quotes that she heard from someone was, "We're not trying to adapt. We are beyond adaptation. And this is what needs to be fixed." And of course, these countries are seeking monetary help, but it's much more than that. It's our moral responsibility to do something about our gases. So I'm going to leave the science part by just giving you a quick summary that is the simplest way to say what's happening. Climate change is real. It has happened, yes, naturally in the past. It is happening now due to human inducement, and it will continue to happen in the future. And the Earth is warming. Humans are causing a significant portion of this recent warming. And it took me about 8 years to decide, yeah, that we are doing it. The warming is going to continue. And globally, we know this. The net result will be bad for people, plants, and animals, especially those most vulnerable. Some places will improve, but if the whole world, the whole globe is hurting because of this, we're all going to hurt. And we've seen this with the pandemic, haven't we? Okay, let's go into another definition and get deeper in this. Move our way through. And the next definition is growing from a stem that does not rise above ground. And this is where we have to dig in and really see, okay, what aren't we noticing that's related to this? Pope Francis, we fail to see the deepest roots of our present failures. And so as you go through Laudato Si, I pulled out these things as illustrations of some of these deep roots that we're seeing could be a factor in leading to our climate change. Unrestrained technology, deified market influence, and weak political responses. These things aren't going to change easily, but maybe if we were more aware of them. What can we change? Us. And what are we doing? Intensified pace of life and work, although maybe that's changed some with COVID. Indifference, I would say basic selfishness, and it's all about me, is one of the biggest problems we're having right now with the vaccine rollout. And dulled consciences. And where are the blames of all this? We're not going to blame global warming. These are the state we are in, and we know that it's affecting our climate in various ways. So this gets pretty depressing when we start thinking about this, but it also points to things we can change. One of my favorite quotes about the whole situation comes from Pope Benedict. The external deserts in the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. For this reason, the ecological crisis is also a summons to profound interior conversion. And I loved your mission for this year that Jean read out. Wow, this is it. This is what's needed. That paragraph 22 17 of Laudato Si. So I think about how my heart is really just broken right now on many levels, on the selfishness of people, on even about our church being attacked in so many ways. And we all have personal suffering from different ways, but let's turn what's happening in the world into our own personal suffering and feel that cry, the cry of the poor, the cry of the earth, because that's, I think, is what helps drive us into action. So another important theme in Laudato Si is this integral ecology. And one way of describing it is that nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. It's integrated. So we can't heal the planet and the climate without healing the people as a whole. We have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. And this is a challenge for me as a scientist, because I'm like, okay, this is what we can do scientifically. And then I'm realizing, oh, it's way, way, way bigger than that. It must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment. And you'll see more and more scientists coming out and saying these kinds of things where they never got political before. So as, and here's the line, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Comes from paragraph 49. We are faced not with two separate crises, it's integrated, one environmental and the other social, but rather with the complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. And strategies for the solution can't just be in one part of it. It's got to be this integrated approach to combat poverty, restore dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. That's a huge agenda. We're called to it. So by probing the roots deeper, we find what? Some good things and bad things, but basically that everything is connected in beautiful ways that can inspire us in some areas. The divine with human. Creative love binds us. And this is where our faith can really, really motivate us to start doing things, maybe for the refugees on the other side of the earth. The earth was here before us and it has been given to us. It's in our scriptures. Everything is connected, our creator with the creatures. Each reflects in its own way a ray of God's infinite wisdom and goodness. From Laudato Si. Everything is connected, us, the earth, and each other. We've forgotten that we ourselves are made up of these elements and we're breathing each other's breath. We're dust of the earth and our very bodies are made up of her elements. I mean, think about that. That's like the second paragraph in the encyclical. If we could just remember this, would we have any problems? No, probably. Everything is connected through the air we breathe and the planet we share. And if we can remember that, it's very motivating. And then this important line, the climate is a common good, belonging to all and meant for all. And so the theme of the common good, we all share it. Totally different from the selfishness that I see so much of right now. We could grow that understanding of the common good. Next definition is relating to the origin or the fundamental. And here, once again, our faith leaps in. I like this tree that looks like Jesus on the cross. Had to put that in. Environmental concern is deeply rooted in the origins of our faith. Scripture, tradition, authoritative teaching. From the very first book of the Bible to the first chapter of John in the New Testament, to our tradition, authoritative teaching, faith perspective now enters the discussion is stated somewhere, but yeah, that's what the Pope has done for us by making, I think there are more people of faith that are not Catholic who have read the encyclicals than Catholics, if you looked at it by percentage. People have been very, very happy to have this faith leadership in this issue. And we have leaders, some who go way back. St. Francis, Hildegard of Bingen. These are a few of the so-called saints that of the environment. Katerina Tekakwitha, Dorothy Day and her whole farm program. And one of the who's very special to me, I'm blanking out on her name, but you know who she is, who was in the Amazon and died, gave her life for the Amazon.
Dorothy Stang.
Thank you, Dorothy Stang. Boy, I hate those memory drops. And then, of course, we've got the guys, our wonderful encyclicals, actually, because every single one of these guys wrote about the environment. Maybe you don't remember hearing about it in the earlier ones, but especially Benedict, and of course, Pope Francis. And then this is the Blessed Bartholomew, who is with the Orthodox. He and the Pope have been together. That he has been promoting care for creation long before even Pope Francis. So, some of the quotes: the relationship between human beings and the environment should mirror the creative love of God. I already said that one of Pope Benedict. And getting to the next definition, we're almost working our way through our definitions, will be done very soon. Favoring extreme changes in existing views, habits, conditions, or institutions. So this is real conversion on a big scale. And here's where Laudato Si started blowing my mind, saying, well, none of this is going to happen, but maybe it will. A global consensus needs to be happening. Technological progress has so far proved incapable of finding effective ways of dealing with grave environmental and social problems. I'm starting to see a change in this. Google trying to be all run on solar power, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not just the big corporations that are doing it, but they are being pushed by people. I taught Introduction to Global Change for like 24 years. And I remember going into just telling them all the science. And then at one point, I started seeing in their faces that I was giving them no future and that I had to start presenting some of the solutions. So my husband and I, we got going. We got solar panels. I got an electric car. All the kinds of things that the kids would be interested in, and we tied in more of this into their curriculum because it's their future. One of the truest quotes in the whole encyclical: politics and business have been slow to react. In a way, measurement with the urgency, and that's the problem. And I think you're hearing it a lot, the urgency of the crisis. That was the message and the disappointment of the Glasgow meeting, which Paris had been a little more effective because they actually came out with an agreement. Glasgow's, they're still, they didn't go as far as people felt they should for the urgency that it increases. Right on paragraph 165, the Pope says we've got to get fossil fuels out of operation, or at least only in places where we need them the most. And the Catholic Church has been promoting a big effort on this with other churches, parishes, and trying to help the divestment. Many of the Catholic orders are doing divestment. Although the post-industrial period may well be remembered as one of the most irresponsible in history. Think about that quote. There is reason to hope, says Francis, that humanity at the dawn of the 21st century will be remembered for having generously shouldered this grave responsibility. Integral ecology is the answer, according to Pope Francis. The climate is that common good, belonging to all and meant for all. And if we started to understand that more, it could drive us. Maybe the system, we could promote best practice instead of just avoiding bad practice. Build back better, which is not happening too well, but it was a good idea. Let's get it done. And for us, while the existing world order proves powerless, don't you feel powerless sometime to assume these responsibilities? We as individuals or your group can really make a difference. And that's what the Laudato Si Action Platform is all about. And I can talk to you more about that. We're just starting it up in our parish, and I may actually be doing a Zoom to help people get registered with it over the next month or so. So do look at that. We can talk more about that afterwards. And Francis reminds us that everyone's talents and involvement are needed in this to redress the damage caused by human abuse of God's creation. What a term, what a phrase, human abuse of God's creation. Truly much can be done. We've got solar power panels on our parish church. Just individually modifying consumption, doing better on how we recycle, sustainable agriculture, bigger things and small things. There's all sorts of levels we can enter in. And with a group that's motivated, they can enter into some of these larger levels. The environmental challenge and its human roots concern and affect us all. And in the very early days of the Catholic Climate Covenant movement that I'm part of, they used to use this, who's under your carbon footprint? And I still think it's a very powerful thing to think about when I'm using energy. This is a Pope Francis quote, and I think it's my favorite double negative ever. We must not think that these efforts are not going to change the world. I'll leave you with this, thinking of something growing through asphalt. That's what it feels like to us sometimes. There is a nobility in the duty to care for creation through little daily actions. This is the part that always I go back to and gives me hope because it's something I can do. Start by doing what is necessary. This is a St. Francis quote. Then do what is possible. And suddenly you are doing the impossible. Impossible. Live Laudato Si, and thank you.